The black Lamborghini stopped in front of Valion Technologies headquarters at the exact moment the shareholder meeting began. Every employee standing outside went completely still when they recognized the man stepping out. Ryan, the same man their CEO had terminated without explanation just 2 weeks earlier. The worn suit was gone. The look of defeat was gone. On the glass steps above, CEO Olivia Hart stood frozen, her face losing its composure for the first time as she watched the man she had fired walk back through the front doors alongside one of the most powerful investors in the city. But the Lamborghini wasn't what frightened her most. Ryan Cole had spent 11 years at Valion Technologies solving problems that other people created. Not the kind of problems that got written up in press releases or celebrated at quarterly reviews, the kind that happened at 2 in the morning when a core system went dark and the entire engineering floor was asleep. He was the one who got the call. He was the one who fixed it. And by the time everyone else arrived the next morning, the crisis had already been buried, the logs cleaned up, and Ryan was back at his desk, drinking bad coffee like nothing had happened. That was how he operated, quietly, completely without any expectation of recognition. Over 11 years, he had become the kind of employee that a company depends on, but never actually sees present in every critical moment, invisible in every conversation that mattered. His name didn't appear on product launches. It didn't appear in leadership announcements. It appeared in incident reports and system architecture documents that only 3 people in the company had clearance to read. That was the whole of his professional life at Valion, and for a long time he had told himself it was enough. His personal life was simpler and emptier. After his divorce several years back, Ryan had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the north side of Chicago, close enough to the office that he could walk to work when the weather allowed. The apartment had good light in the mornings and almost no furniture. He cooked simple meals, kept irregular hours, and spent most of his evenings in front of a second monitor that had nothing to do with Valion. That monitor was where the real work happened. The work nobody knew about, the work he had been building in private for nearly 3 years. The project had no official name. Ryan thought of it simply as the system. It was an AI data architecture, unlike anything currently deployed at enterprise scale. Not because the concept was alien, but because the structural logic underneath it was different in ways that would take most engineers several hours just to follow on paper. Ryan had built it from scratch, using his own hardware, his own cloud accounts, his own money. Nothing from Valion had touched it. He had been careful about that from the beginning, careful in the way that a person is careful when they know on some level that what they are building is worth protecting. He maintained 2 entirely separate work environments, one for Valion, one for the system, and had never once allowed them to intersect. Different machines, different networks, different authentication credentials. The separation wasn't paranoia, it was discipline, the same discipline he applied to everything he built. When you spent your career inside systems, you understood that the most dangerous failures were never the dramatic ones. They were the small, incremental compromises that accumulated over time until the boundary between 2 things that were supposed to stay separate no longer existed. Olivia Hart had been CEO of Valion for 2.5 years. She was sharp-controlled and exceptionally good at managing the image of a company while restructuring its interior. She had arrived with a mandate to modernize Valion's product direction and had spent her first year replacing department heads, rebranding the company's external presence, and positioning the firm for a major institutional investment round. She moved through the company like someone who always knew exactly where the exits were. Most people admired her. A few were afraid of her. Ryan had mostly stayed out of her orbit entirely, which in retrospect may have been its own kind of mistake. He first noticed her attention shift toward him about 4 months before everything collapsed. It was subtle, a few questions about his workload that came through his direct manager rather than from Olivia. Directly, a review of his system access permissions that was framed as routine. Nothing alarming on its own. But Ryan had spent 11 years reading technical systems, for hidden irregularities, and the skill transferred. He noticed the pattern. He didn't know what it meant yet, so he said nothing, and kept his head down and kept working. The second signal came 3 weeks later. A member of Valion's internal IT security team ran a compliance audit on the personal devices registered to Ryan's employee profile standard procedure, according to the memo part of a company-wide review ahead of a potential licensing agreement. Ryan had no personal devices registered to his employee profile because he had never used personal devices on company infrastructure. The audit found nothing because there was nothing to find, but the fact that someone had looked, and looked specifically at him, settled into the back of his mind and stayed there. The Monday morning it ended was unremarkable in every external way. Chicago in late October, gray sky, the kind of cold that hadn't fully committed yet. Ryan had arrived at the office at 7:45, which was normal for him, made coffee, and was halfway through reviewing a network segmentation report when his manager sent a single-line message asking him to come up to the executive floor. No subject, no context. Ryan read it, finished the paragraph he was on, and went upstairs. Olivia was already standing when he entered the conference room. Her assistant was present. So was someone from Human Resources, whose name Ryan had never learned. The termination letter was already printed and sitting on the table facing his chair. He understood what was happening before anyone spoke. Olivia delivered it cleanly, the way someone delivers information they have rehearsed enough that it no longer requires any actual feeling. She told him the company was repositioning its technical division and needed a more dynamic team profile going forward. She said it wasn't a reflection of his contribution. She said the decision had been made at the board level. Every sentence was accurate enough to be unchallengeable and empty enough to mean nothing. Ryan sat and listened to all of it without interrupting, because there was nothing to interrupt. This was not a conversation. It was a notification. His badge was deactivated before he reached the elevator. The HR representative walked him to his desk and stood nearby while he collected the few personal items he kept there. A spare charger, a coffee mug, a small notebook he used for system sketches. It fit inside a standard cardboard box with room to spare. 11 years in a company, and the physical evidence of it was light enough to carry in one hand. He walked out through the lobby without looking back. Outside on the sidewalk, a few colleagues he recognized were coming in for the day. 2 of them saw the box and looked away immediately. A third made brief eye contact, and Ryan watched the recognition cross his face, then watched the decision happen, the one where the person decides it's safer not to acknowledge what they've just seen. Ryan kept walking. He heard someone behind him say, quietly enough that it was probably not meant to carry, that it was only a matter of time. That he'd been there too long anyway. He took the long way home. Back in his apartment, Ryan set the cardboard box on the kitchen counter and didn't touch it again for the rest of the day. He sat at his secondary workstation, the one with all the personal project files, and did something he rarely allowed himself to do. He went still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a person trying to hold the structure of their own thoughts together, while something underneath shifts. He had known in some background way that his position at Valion was not secure. He had felt the ground changing under him for months. But knowing a thing abstractly and living inside it are different experiences, and Ryan sat with that difference for a long time before he opened his laptop and started working through what came next. What came next arrived faster than he expected, and it came in a form he wasn't prepared for. Late that evening, Ryan was cross-referencing a time-stamped development log from one of the system's earlier build phases, a habit he had maintained for documentation purposes, when he noticed an access anomaly. It was small. The thing that only appeared if you already knew what the original file state was supposed to look like. A directory within one of his personal cloud storage environments, isolated and separately authenticated, had been queried from an IP address he didn't recognize. The timestamp placed it 6 days before his termination. The query hadn't copied anything. It had only looked. But it had looked in exactly the right place, a location that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't already understood the system's architecture well enough to know where to find it. Ryan ran the trace again. Then he ran it a third time, pulling a parallel log from a secondary authentication record he kept offline. The access pattern was consistent. Someone inside Valion's internal network had located his private project environment and examined its structure before he was terminated. He didn't call a lawyer that night. He didn't make any calls at all. He sat in the dark with the data in front of him and began to understand what the last 4 months had actually been. The questions about his workload, the device compliance audit, the access permission review, the clean rehearsed termination with a letter already printed and waiting. None of it had been about restructuring. Olivia had been moving him out of position, clearing the board of a piece she'd identified as a future threat before the board itself understood what that piece was worth. Ryan wasn't angry. Or rather, the anger was there, but it was quiet and cold, and didn't interfere with his thinking. He had spent his entire career in environments where the loudest response was almost never the most effective one. He understood that what he did in the next 72 hours would determine everything. There was one name he had been sitting on for months without acting on it: Lucas Bennett. Bennett was the kind of investor whose name appeared regularly in the financial press, but whose actual operations were deliberately opaque. A man who had backed 4 significant technology companies in the previous decade, all of them before the market understood what it was looking at. He was not easy to reach. He was not the kind of person who responded to cold contact. But Ryan had a specific channel, a private technical forum, where Bennett occasionally surfaced under a secondary account to engage with engineering discussions. Ryan had noticed the account's pattern several months earlier and had filed it away without acting on it. The way he filed away most things he wasn't ready to use. He composed a message that night. Not a pitch, not a plea, a technical summary, precise and brief, with 3 attached documents that showed the architecture of the system in enough detail that someone who understood what they were looking at would understand immediately what it represented. He included the access log anomaly. He included the termination date. He wrote nothing that was speculative or emotional. He sent it and closed the laptop. He didn't sleep well. But he slept. The response came 31 hours later. It was 4 sentences long. Lucas Bennett confirmed he had read the documents, confirmed he understood the architecture, and asked Ryan to suggest a meeting location at his earliest convenience. The final sentence was the one Ryan read twice. "I've been watching this build for longer than you probably realize." Ryan looked at that sentence for a long moment, then set his phone face down on the desk and went back to the development logs. There was still a great deal of work to do. The system wasn't complete. The documentation needed to be airtight. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in an executive office with a view of Lake Michigan, Olivia Hart was almost certainly already moving her next piece into position. Ryan let her move it. He was patient. He had been patient for 11 years inside a company that never saw him clearly, and he could be patient for a little while longer. He pulled up the architecture files and started working through the final build phase line by line, the way he had always worked, quietly, completely, and without any expectation that the people around him were paying attention. They never did, until it was too late for it to matter. The meeting with Lucas Bennett took place in a private room at a members-only club in the West Loop, the kind of place that had no signage on the door and no listing online. Bennett arrived alone, which Ryan had not expected. He was older than his photographs suggested, somewhere in his early 60s, compact and unhurried, with the particular stillness of a person who had long since stopped needing to perform confidence for anyone. He ordered water. He did not look at his phone once during the entire meeting. Ryan had prepared a structured presentation, but Bennett waved it aside within the first 2 minutes and asked a single question. Instead, walk me through the core logic of the data layer, not the application, just the layer itself. Ryan walked him through it. Bennett listened without interrupting for 22 minutes straight. When Ryan finished, Bennett set down his glass and said the system was more coherent than he had expected, and that he did not use the word coherent lightly. He told Ryan that he had first encountered references to the project through a closed engineering forum about 14 months earlier, and that he had spent the following months trying to identify who was behind it. He had not expected it to be a staff engineer at a mid-tier enterprise technology firm. Ryan told him it was exactly that kind of assumption he had been counting on. Bennett looked at him for a moment, and then nodded, once the way someone nods when they've confirmed something they already suspected. The conversation lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, nothing had been signed, and no specific figures had been named, but something had been established, a framework of mutual understanding that both men recognized as the beginning of something real. Ryan walked back to his apartment in the cold and felt for the first time since the termination that the ground under him was solid again. What he didn't know was that Valion had already started moving. Within days of his termination, the internal narrative inside the company had been carefully shaped. Ryan heard about it secondhand through a former colleague named Derek, who still sent occasional messages and had enough decency to be uncomfortable with what he was reporting. Derek was a mid-level infrastructure engineer who had worked 2 desks down from Ryan for 6 years. Not a close friend, but the kind of person who showed up reliably in the small ways that mattered, covering a shift, sharing a direct observation, telling the truth when it would have been easier not to. His messages arrived apologetically prefaced with qualifications, as though he was aware that reporting bad news and being the source of it were sometimes hard to distinguish. Ryan appreciated the honesty and told him so. The story circulating through Valion's technical leadership was that Ryan had been a performance liability for years, someone whose institutional knowledge had masked a consistent failure to innovate, someone whose reluctance to collaborate had quietly held teams back. It was the kind of story that was impossible to directly refute, because it was constructed entirely from reframed truths. Ryan had been reluctant to collaborate, because collaboration in that environment had meant watching other people absorb credit for work he had done. That part of the story naturally did not circulate. Derek also told him something more concrete and more troubling. There had been an internal presentation 2 days after Ryan's termination, a technical briefing to Valion's product leadership team that covered in significant structural detail a new AI data framework the company's engineering division was apparently developing in-house. Derek had not attended the meeting personally, but a colleague who had described the architecture in terms that tracked closely with what Ryan had spent 3 years building in his apartment. Closely enough that Derek had felt the need to mention it, and closely enough that Ryan's first instinct had been right. Olivia had not been removing dead weight. She had been clearing the name off the invention before the invention became valuable. Ryan took the access logs to a technology attorney named Martin Greer, who operated out of a small firm in the Loop and had a reputation for intellectual property work in the software sector. Greer reviewed the documentation carefully and gave Ryan an honest assessment that had 2 parts. The first part was encouraging the architecture files carried time-stamped development records going back nearly 3 years, all stored on independently authenticated personal infrastructure, with no Valion system, fingerprints anywhere in the build history. The ownership chain was clean. The second part was less encouraging if Valion moved to publicly release or patent a derivative product, before Ryan had formally filed and before the access violation was established as legally actionable. The litigation process would become significantly longer and more expensive, and outcomes in technology IP cases were never certain, even with strong documentation. Greer told Ryan plainly that the timeline was not on his side. Ryan filed what he could file immediately, a formal intellectual property registration on the core architecture, accompanied by the full development record. Greer moved as quickly as the process allowed, but filing was not the same as protection, and Ryan understood that the window between where things stood now and where they could go wrong was narrower than he would have liked. He went back to work. He finished the final build phase of the system, documented every component, and spent 3 consecutive nights stress-testing the architecture against the most aggressive failure scenarios he could design. The system held. Whatever else was uncertain, the work itself was solid, and that steadied him in a way that nothing external could. Lucas Bennett called him 10 days after their first meeting. The conversation was brief and direct. Bennett told Ryan that he had completed his own technical review of the architecture documents with 2 independent consultants whose judgment he trusted and that their assessment aligned with his own. He then told Ryan that an international investment consortium he had worked with previously had expressed significant interest after a preliminary briefing, and that the figure currently on the table subject to due diligence and final negotiation was in the range of $30 to $40 million. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Bennett told him to take whatever time he needed to process. The then clarified that time was actually the one thing they didn't have in abundance, and that he needed Ryan to authorize the next steps within 48 hours. Ryan authorized them within 6. What happened next came fast, and from multiple directions at once, which Ryan later understood had been the point. 3 days after Bennett's consortium initiated formal due diligence, Vallion's legal team filed a complaint alleging that Ryan Cole had, during his tenure as a systems engineer, misappropriated proprietary data and trade secrets belonging to Valion Technologies. The complaint named specific files and claimed they had been developed using company resources during company time. Every specific claim in the filing was technically false, and demonstrably so, given Ryan's documentation. But the filing itself didn't need to be true to do damage. It only needed to exist, and to exist loudly enough to create uncertainty in the minds of the people conducting due diligence on the other side of the deal. It worked to a degree. 2 members of the investment consortium requested a hold on proceedings pending review of the legal complaint. One withdrew entirely, citing risk exposure. The transaction that had been moving toward completion slowed to something close to a stop. Bennett's team continued working, but Ryan could feel the momentum draining in real time, the way a system bleeds pressure when a seal gives way somewhere you can't immediately locate. At the same time, Valion's communications team quietly began surfacing Ryan's name in industry conversations in ways that carried no fingerprints. A technology journalist Ryan had never spoken to published a short piece speculating about the circumstances of Ryan's departure from Valion, including anonymous sourcing that described him as a difficult personality who had resisted the company's modernization efforts. The piece was careful enough to be legally untouchable and damaging enough to be effective. Former colleagues who had been cordial in the weeks immediately following the termination became suddenly unavailable. Messages went unanswered. An engineer Ryan had worked closely with for 4 years sent a single-line reply to a professional question, "Probably better if we don't stay in contact right now." And that was the end of that. Greer called Ryan to tell him that Valion's legal team had also moved to freeze access to 2 cloud-based technical accounts that Ryan had used during the development period, on the grounds that the accounts might contain materials subject to the IP dispute. The freeze was an overreach. Greer was confident it would be reversed on challenge, but reversing it would take time, and time was exactly what the other side was trying to consume. Ryan listened to all of it from his apartment, sitting at the same desk where he had spent 3 years building the thing everyone was now fighting over, and tried to locate the boundary between strategic patience and actual loss. He was running low on money. The legal fees were real, the income had stopped, and the deal that was supposed to resolve both of those problems had been deliberately disrupted. He had been careful with his savings, but careful had a horizon, and he could see the edge of it. He did the math one evening and concluded he had approximately 9 weeks before the financial situation became critical. 9 weeks was not a long time when the legal process moved at the pace it moved. Then came the call that nearly ended everything. Bennett reached Ryan on a Thursday evening, and his tone was different from any previous conversation, measured in a way that had weight behind it, the way a careful person sounds when they are preparing to say something they have been sitting with for a while. He told Ryan that 2 of the remaining consortium members had formally requested a 60-day suspension of proceedings. Their legal counsel had advised them that the outstanding IP complaint represented an unresolved material risk, and that proceeding before its resolution created liability exposure they were not willing to accept. Bennett told Ryan he was continuing to work the problem, that he had not lost confidence in the technology or the documentation, and that he believed the case was fundamentally sound. But he also told Ryan, with the directness that Ryan had come to recognize as the man's defining quality, that the next few days were going to determine whether this was still a viable transaction or whether they needed to completely restructure their approach. Ryan thanked him and ended the call. He sat in the apartment in the dark, not working for once, just sitting. Outside Chicago in November was doing what Chicago did. Wind off the lake, gray pressing down from every direction, the city indifferent to individual circumstances, the way large cities always are. He had been through the math enough times to know where it landed. The legal freeze would likely be resolved in his favor, but not quickly. The consortium was retreating. Greer's fees were accumulating. His account balance was the lowest it had been in over a decade. He had no company, no salary, no professional reputation in the industry he had worked in for 11 years. And the technology he had built to change all of that was currently the center of a legal dispute, specifically designed to prevent it from doing so. He was in every measurable way back where he had started, a man who had been terminated, with nothing, sitting alone in a quiet apartment, invisible to the industry that had consumed the best years of his professional life. For a long time he didn't move. Then he opened his laptop, pulled up the architecture files, and went back through the complete development record from the very beginning, not to find anything new, but to remind himself of what was actually true. 3 years of documented work, timestamps that could not be fabricated retroactively, authentication logs that placed every file in his personal environment, on his personal infrastructure, built with his own money and his own time. The access violation from Valion's network, logged and preserved. All of it clean, all of it real, all of it his. He stayed at the desk until 2 in the morning going through it all. By the end, he was not less afraid exactly, but he was clearer. The situation was bad. The timeline was compressed. The people opposing him had more resources and fewer scruples, and had been operating in this space long enough to know how to make an opponent feel small and isolated and finished. But the underlying truth of the situation had not changed. He had built something real. They had tried to take it, and the record of that attempt existed in a form they could not erase. He sent Bennett a message before he went to sleep. It was 3 sentences. He told Bennett he understood the situation, that he was not going to change his position, and that he wanted to meet in person before the end of the week. He told him there was one more piece of documentation he had not yet shared, something he had held back precisely for a moment, like this one, and that he believed it would change the calculation for the consortium members who were still at the table. He turned off the desk lamp and went to bed. The shareholder meeting was in 4 days. Whatever was going to happen, it was going to happen before then, or it wasn't going to happen at all. The documentation Ryan had held back was not dramatic in appearance. It was a single compressed archive containing a secondary authentication log from a network monitoring tool he had installed on his personal cloud environment 18 months earlier. Not because he had anticipated anything specific, but because he was an engineer, and engineers built redundancy into systems they cared about. The log captured not just the fact of the access from Valion's internal network, but the full session, traced the specific user credential pathway, the internal machine identifier, and a sequence of directory navigations that demonstrated with clinical precision that whoever had accessed his environment had not stumbled into it accidentally. They had known exactly where to look, which meant they had already understood the system structure, which meant the examination had not been exploratory. It had been confirmatory. Someone at Valion had already mapped his project before they sent someone in to verify it. Ryan had shown Greer the primary access log weeks earlier. He had not shown him this. He had kept it separate and offline, saved to an encrypted drive stored in a fireproof box under his desk, and he had told himself he would only surface it when the moment required it to be decisive, rather than merely useful, That moment had arrived. He met with Bennett the following morning at the same West Loop Club. He transferred the archive to Bennett's secure device in person, walked him through what the log contained and what it demonstrated, and then sat back and let Bennett read it twice. When Bennett looked up, his expression had not changed significantly, but something behind it had the particular quality of a person who has just watched an uncertain position become a certain one. He told Ryan he would have his technical consultants authenticate the log within 24 hours, and that if it held up, which he already believed it would, the consortium members who had requested the suspension would need to be given a choice: return to the table with full information or step aside entirely and watch the transaction close without them. The log held up. The 48 hours that followed were the most compressed and consequential of the entire process. Bennett worked the phones with the efficiency of someone who had operated in high-stakes environments long enough to know exactly which calls to make in which order. 2 of the 3 consortium members who had suspended participation returned to the table within a day after their own legal teams reviewed the authenticated trace log and concluded that Vallion's IP complaint was not only meritless, but potentially constituted an abuse of process. The 3rd did not return, but by then it didn't matter. The transaction had enough committed capital behind it to proceed, and the due diligence team, which had never actually stopped working, had everything it needed to finalize the acquisition structure. On the evening before Vallion's annual shareholder meeting, the acquisition was completed. Ryan Cole signed the paperwork in a conference room at Greer's firm at 9:47 in the evening. The final figure was $38 million for full acquisition of the system's core architecture and its associated intellectual property portfolio, with a structured advisory arrangement that would keep Ryan involved in the technology's development through the transition period. Greer shook his hand. Bennett, who had called in for the signing, said only that it had been a pleasure to do business with someone who knew how to hold a position, and then ended the call. Ryan gathered his copies of the signed documents, put them in his bag, and took a cab home. He did not stop anywhere on the way. He slept better than he had in weeks. The shareholder meeting began at 10 in the morning. Ryan did not need to be there. The transaction was complete. The documentation was filed, and there was no legal or practical reason for him to set foot anywhere near Valiant Technologies ever again. But Bennett had called him early that morning and made a suggestion, not a request, a suggestion that it might be worth arriving together visibly before the meeting began. He told Ryan that certain things had more impact when they were witnessed rather than reported, and that the investors and board members walking into that building deserved to understand in real time what the company's leadership had done. Ryan had thought about it for approximately 30 seconds, and then agreed. Bennett's car, a black Lamborghini that Ryan would later learn the man drove exclusively because he found the reaction it produced in financial environments useful as a behavioral signal, arrived outside Ryan's building at 9:15. Ryan was already outside waiting in a clean dark suit he had bought the previous afternoon. Not an expensive suit, a correct one. He got in without ceremony, and they drove to Vallion's headquarters in almost complete silence, which suited both of them. The building came into view at 9:40. There were already people gathered outside, employees arriving for the workday. A few investors Ryan recognized from Vallion's public filings, 2 people with cameras from a financial news outlet that covered the city's tech sector. When the Lamborghini stopped at the curb and Ryan stepped out, the recognition moved through the small crowd in a visible wave. He saw it happen, the double take, the rapid reassessment, the particular expression that crosses a person's face when reality fails to match the story they had been told. The man with the cardboard box and the worn suit, the one who had been quietly described as finished and irrelevant and difficult, that man had returned in a car that announced its own arrival, standing next to Lucas Bennett, whose presence in this context required no explanation to anyone who understood what his presence meant. Olivia Hart was on the steps. Ryan saw her the moment he turned toward the building. She was dressed for the shareholder meeting, composed in the way she was always composed or had been until this moment. She stood at the top of the glass steps with 2 members of her executive team flanking her, and she watched Ryan and Bennett cross the plaza together, and whatever internal machinery usually kept her face exactly where she needed it to be, appeared for the first time Ryan had ever observed, to fail her. Not dramatically, not a collapse, but the control slipped just slightly, and what showed underneath it was something that sat between recognition and fear. The expression of a person who has just understood that a plan they believed was airtight has already been resolved against them. Ryan did not rush toward her. He walked at his normal pace, the pace of someone who had nowhere more important to be and nothing left to prove. Bennett walked beside him and said nothing. The cameras had come closer. Several board members who had been heading into the building had stopped to watch. Bennett stepped slightly forward and addressed the gathered group in a voice that carried without effort. He told them that his firm had completed the previous evening the full acquisition of an artificial intelligence data architecture created and solely owned by Ryan Cole, not by Valion Technologies, not jointly developed, not connected to any company resource or timeline. He told them that the acquisition had been finalized at $38 million and that the intellectual property, registration, development, documentation, and transaction records were all publicly filed and available. He told them that among those documents was an authenticated network access log demonstrating that Valion's internal systems had been used to examine Ryan's private project without authorization 6 days prior to his termination. He said all of this in the tone of a person reading a weather report. Informational, neither hostile nor satisfied. Simply accurate. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it. Ryan looked at Olivia Hart. She was looking back at him, and the composure had not fully returned yet. Her executive flanks had both taken a subtle half-step away from her, the kind of unconscious physical repositioning that happens when people who understand proximity to power begin recalculating their proximity to a person whose power has just visibly shifted. Ryan walked up the steps until he was close enough that the conversation was between them and not for the crowd, and then he spoke at a normal volume. He told her that she had seen the value of what he was building before he had understood it himself, that she had moved to take it precisely because she recognized what it was worth, and that recognition in its way was the most honest assessment of his work that anyone at Valion had ever given him. Olivia Hart said nothing. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked past him, and Ryan could see in the adjustment of her attention that she was already calculating not a response to him, but an approach to everything that was now in motion around her. That was who she was. He didn't find it surprising. He didn't find it contemptible. He found it in that moment almost clarifying. He nodded once and went inside to find Martin Greer, who was waiting in the lobby with a second copy of the transaction documentation for formal delivery to Valion's board chair. The next several hours moved through their own logic. Greer delivered the documentation. The board chair called an emergency session that ran concurrently with the shareholder meeting. The full network access log was entered into the record. By early afternoon, Valion's stock had dropped significantly as the shareholder floor absorbed the news that the company's CEO had at minimum authorized the unauthorized examination of a former employee's private intellectual property in the weeks before his termination, and had subsequently filed a legally unfounded complaint against that same employee in an apparent effort to disrupt a transaction she had known was coming. The complaint against Ryan was formally withdrawn by end of day. The board announced an internal investigation before the market closed. Ryan was not in the building for most of it. After delivering the documents with Greer, he walked out through the lobby and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold November air and thought about nothing in particular. The financial news cameras were still outside. He didn't speak to them. He found a cab and went home. He ate dinner. He read for an hour. He went to bed before 10. In the months that followed, Ryan opened a small technology company in a 4-story building near the lake on the north edge of the city. The offices were not large, but they had the same quality of morning light that his apartment had, which was the detail he had noticed first when he signed the lease. The team was not large either, 11 people by the end of the first quarter, most of them engineers he had identified through the same closed technical forums where Bennett had first found traces of his work. He interviewed each of them personally and asked the same question Bennett had once asked him: "Walk me through the core logic, not the application, just the layer itself." The ones who could answer that question without reaching for a slide deck were the ones he hired. He did not hold a launch event. He did not give interviews. A brief item appeared in a technology publication noting that Ryan Cole, formerly of Valiant Technologies, had founded a new firm focused on AI infrastructure, backed by Bennett's consortium. The item was accurate and short, and Ryan read it once and moved on. Derek sent a message 2 months after the shareholder meeting, longer than his usual brief updates. He told Ryan that the atmosphere inside Valiant had changed completely in the weeks following the board investigation, that the internal narrative about Ryan had collapsed almost overnight, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse than the original story had been. Several of the people who had been most visible in spreading that narrative had quietly requested transfers or taken extended leave. The engineering floor, Derek said, had become the kind of place where people were careful about what they said, and to whom, which was a different kind of problem than the one that had existed before, but a problem nonetheless. He said he was thinking about leaving. Ryan told him to trust that instinct and helped him update his resume over the following week. The news about Olivia Hart arrived through Derek as well, a short follow-up message informing Ryan that the board investigation had concluded and that Olivia Hart had separated from Valiant Technologies, effective immediately under terms that were not publicly disclosed. The company had appointed an interim CEO from its board and was conducting a search for permanent leadership. Derek's message ended with a sentence that said simply that he thought Ryan deserved to know. Ryan read the message, replied with 2 words of thanks, and set his phone down on the desk. He did not feel what he might have expected to feel. No satisfaction, no closure, nothing that resembled the resolution of a long tension. What he felt was closer to the absence of something that had been taking up space without him fully noticing. Lighter. Not happy exactly, just lighter. He pulled the architecture files back up on his screen and went back to work. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough. He had not set out to destroy anyone. He had not built the system to prove a point or settle a score. He had built it because it was the most honest thing he knew how to do. Show up, do the work, build something real, and trust that real things eventually find their own level, regardless of who tries to bury them. Olivia Hart had looked at him and seen a liability when she should have seen a person. That mistake had been hers to make and hers to live with. Ryan had no further use for it. There was a version of this story where he had fought, louder, moved, faster, spent less time being invisible inside a company that didn't see him. Maybe that version ended better, or maybe it ended the same way. But with more noise along the route. He didn't spend much time on that version. The one he had actually lived had brought him here to a desk in a building with his name on the lease, with a team of 11 people who had been hired because they understood the work and for no other reason. Outside the window, Lake Michigan was flat and gray in the early winter light, and the city was moving through its own uninterested morning, and Ryan Cole was exactly where he needed to be, quiet, focused, doing work that was entirely and only his. No one had given it to him. No one could take it back. That was the point. That had always been the point.